Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The Mouse That Roars, news and commentary from regularguy.com to you all over the world, everywhere. Thank you for listening and spreading this around in our wonderful secret little, communication network. It's a beautiful thing to have free speech that can't be suppressed, isn't it? Wow. What a thought, huh? Who'd have thunk it? Anyway, I'm here today with a very, very special guest. As you know, being someone who's been a long-time supporter of military and folks involved in the military, having once won an award from the Vietnam Veterans Association, I'm familiar with the military in this country, and I am, a great supporter and friend of the military. And to find that Ron Paul, Congressman and Dr. Ron Paul, has become the chosen one, so to speak, just is mind-boggling to me, but in a positive way. I'm very excited about it. And people are consistently asking me, well, why do veterans like Ron Paul? He's got these goofy policies, and he's against the military and wars and blah, blah, blah. No, that's not, I don't think, exactly the way the military folks see it. Colonel Doug Macgregor joins us here. He's a retired, decorated combat veteran, author of 4 books, got a Ph.D., That means he's smarter than most of you, and don't forget it. And he's heading up Veterans for Ron Paul in 2012, and we meet him now. Hello, Doug. How are you?
Good to talk with you.
It's a pleasure to have you on board. Explain, because I get asked all the time, why would anyone in the military support Ron Paul? Tell us why.
Well, I think Ron Paul's larger vision for the United States is something that really resonates with people in the military, and that vision is very closely aligned with the thinking of the people that founded the United States, wrote the Constitution, and created the society we live in. And effectively, he, like Washington and Hamilton, believes that the United States should be the world's engine of prosperity, that by building ourselves up economically and spreading prosperity to other countries, we also ultimately become a model for other countries. And it's the right way to export what is best about America. And in that sense, Ron Paul thinks, and I think most of us in the military, who, particularly those of us who've served in combat and have been in the Middle East and seen what the nature of that world is really like, think that, as Ron Paul does, that America should be a beacon of light to the world, not a crusading sword. That the best way to export our thinking and our way of life is not at the point of a bayonet, particularly to places in the world that frankly lack the foundations in terms of economics, politics, and culture to really absorb what we offer.
Right. I mean, I think when I watch people out there in the media and they have these really distorted views of Ron Paul, and they've done a pretty good job of tearing him down. I mean, admittedly, I think the media has, taken Ron Paul on as a project to destroy, and yet here you have these wonderful, wonderful large gatherings of folks at UCLA or up in Chico, California, or up in Wisconsin, crowds that are just, comparatively monstrously larger than anything else out there for the other candidates. You don't see these crowds assembling for Santorum or Romney or the other guys. It's just pretty clear that Ron Paul has captured the hearts and minds of the youth of this country. He's got the military support. He's drawing huge crowds, and of course there's all kinds of trickery we're finding in some of these Republican-controlled primaries and caucuses. How do you defeat that when the entire world is against you? How do you beat it?
Well, keep in mind that when deceit is almost universal, speaking the truth is a revolutionary act, and that is the view that the status quo, whether it's in the so-called Republican Party or the Democrats, view Ron Paul. That's how they see him, as this revolutionary character who dares to speak the truth. And the truth is, certainly in defense and foreign policy, that we have squandered trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives over many decades in places around the world that frankly were not strategically important to the United States, and in places that did not benefit from our investment any more than we did.
I think that my understanding of it, and forgive me, I'm just a lowly talk show guy, but my understanding over the years has been more like this. If they don't present a threat to us, it's none of our business. In other words, if the folks in the Middle East, if the people in Iraq or the people in Saudi Arabia or the people in Syria or the people in Libya or wherever. If they're upset and worried about Iran getting a nuclear bomb, they should take care of it, right?
Well, there's even more to it. I mean, no, you're not wrong. You're right, and that's essentially the position that Americans should take. They should always ask the question, why should we be involved? Unfortunately, that's been stood on its head, and certainly for the last 20 years, we've adopted the Madeleine Albright solution, which is that nothing in the world can happen without us, that we are the quote-unquote indispensable superpower, and it's bankrupted us, and it's cost the lives not only of thousands of Americans and destroyed the lives of tens of thousands more, but it's also resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people that were never important to the United States, were never a threat to the United States.
Right.
But there's something more to it, and that is this unfortunate tendency to take something like Iran and blow it out of all proportion to reality. Iran is a nation of 78 million people, most of whom live by our standards in abject poverty, most of whom, frankly, are not happy with their current government and would like to see a different one. That doesn't necessarily mean that they want to adopt our form of government. It's just that they're not happy with what they've got. Most of them are absolutely, totally disinterested in what's going on beyond their own borders. And then finally, you're talking about a state of 78 million that spends less on defense than Greece, which is a nation of 11 million. And I can tell you from experience with the Greek military, it's absolutely irrelevant. So if the Greek military is irrelevant and a nation of 11 million that spends more than Iran, just imagine how irrelevant the Iranian military establishment is.
Right.
And when you look at the nuclear program, it's tragic and it's unfortunate for Iran because it's bankrupting them. They don't really need to invest as heavily as they are in nuclear power. But the worst part is that they feel, because of where they live and the states that surround them, that they need a nuclear weapon, not just to deter the Sunni Muslim states that surround them, but also to deter Israel and ultimately the United States from interfering in their affairs. And
Right.
if you look at the world from their standpoint, from where they sit, there are good reasons to want that.
Right.
At the end of the day, though, from our standpoint, and I would argue from Israel's standpoint, their possession of a nuclear weapon, which is going to take them a long time to acquire because simply having it doesn't mean you can deliver it, and finding a way to deliver it is not an unchallenging proposition. The Israelis are so well armed, we're so well armed in that connection that it would be absolute suicide for them to even contemplate the use of a weapon like that in an offensive capacity. So the media, unfortunately, doesn't cooperate and put things in those terms to the American people, and so we tend to induce this paranoia, if you will, and overreaction that is very common. Because remember, and you know this from your own experience in Washington, there are lots of people in Washington who like to equate the use of American military power anywhere in the world with a demonstration of American greatness. It's almost as though if we're using our military against weak, incapable peoples in very backward societies and killing them, that somehow or another that demonstrates our greatness, that makes us a great power. In truth, it doesn't. It's a waste of time, money, and resources, and that's Ron Paul's point. And to get back to the bottom line is that Ron Paul also understands that American economic prosperity, our capacity to produce, our ability to create new technology, to build things, made us the most powerful state in the world, not our military power. The military power was an afterthought. We were already a global power before we had this large military establishment. And he knows that we're not going to maintain an adequate and capable military establishment unless we rebuild that economic prosperity.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
got to be
we're
number one.
borrowing 42 cents of every dollar we spend from the Chinese. So
Yeah.
how much power does that give them?
Well, the interesting part with China is that you would think under normal circumstances that would confer tremendous power on China. But the truth is that China internally swims in a sea of corruption that is beyond anyone's comprehension here in the United States. And they've got about 800 million people living in abject poverty that are moving by the millions from rural areas to urban areas, living in what are virtually economic slave camps. And these people are increasingly unhappy because they don't enjoy a good standard of living, they don't have proper medical care, they don't have clean water, and they are being ruthlessly exploited and brutalized as cheap labor by the ruling Communist Party elites and the people that have acquired so much wealth over the last several years in China. So China is a place ready to explode. And they've squandered trillions of dollars internally on bad programs, bad projects, because they are centrally planned. They are a true socialist state where all decisions are made at the center. You can't run an effective economy that way, which is what we're also discovering in the United States, by the way.
Yeah, well, we've adopted some of those policies that don't seem to be in our best interest long run.
Right.
And it's really frightening for people who love the country, who, are patriots. I mean, I've actually considered expatriating just because I can't stand to get up and read the newspaper every day. It makes me want to cry.
Well, this is the time for everyone who is an American, and I mean an American. I'm not talking about a hyphenated American, a semi-American. I'm talking about those of us who are Americans, first, last, and always. This is the time not to leave. But we've got to stand our ground, and we've got to fight, and we've got to do what we've done historically well, which again is a theme that Ron Paul talks about, and that is that we are a bottom-up society, that the best things happen when it starts in our communities, our cities, our towns, our states, and works its way up. We are not a top-down society, and it's the top-down nature of this big, intrusive government in Washington that not only insists on intervening overseas where we don't need to, at great expense to the American taxpayer, but also wants to intervene and intrude in our private lives. And that's what Ron Paul's been talking about, and I think that's what resonates. And even though it's clear that he's not going to be nominated by the Republican Party, anyone who thinks he's not winning the argument is wrong. Just look carefully at what Santorum and Gingrich have been saying about the economy.
Oh,
Today,
I think
they sound an awful lot like Ron Paul, don't they?
Well, you have to. I mean, first of all, Ron Paul is, I think, going to change the country forever. People they're catching on. They're beginning to understand it's what is it that something's out of the bag. What is it? What's that adage? Anyway, the truth is out there now, and you can't, and I don't know how people think you're going to survive this debt crisis. And I want to, just ask about that, because if we're borrowing 40 plus cents of every dollar we spend, and let's just say that the Chinese economy implodes, or their country somehow gets into a, really deep quagmire, internally they have problems or whatever, and they suddenly say, we can't buy your T-bills anymore, folks, so we need our money back. Where does that leave the country if we're dependent on this foreign influx of cash?
Well, you're right, and this is something that Ron Paul has talked about for 30 years. He began getting real attention in 2008 when the inevitable happened, when the fiscal collapse struck. And what should have happened, as we all know, is that we shouldn't have bailed out at 100% on the dollar all of these large banks on Wall Street and their supporting industries. We should have allowed, some degree of bailout in order to help some of the people that were investors, but certainly not at 100% on the dollar, and certainly not on the scale that we did. Some say we shouldn't have bailed anybody out. That may well be the case, but the point is we did, and what we did is we postponed the critical change and reform in the marketplace that was required, because no one wants the marketplace to work except the American people who depend upon it. The people in Washington want to control the market because that's how they stay in power and that's how they enrich themselves. I don't know if you saw the debates that were held in South Carolina and later on in Florida, but there was one question about lobbying and lobbyists. And Gingrich has gotten himself into difficulty because of his experience with lobbying. Our friend Mitt Romney is yet another character who's got lots of interesting relations with various powerful forces on Wall Street and in private industry through lobbyists. It came to Ron Paul, and Ron Paul said, look, I don't know any lobbyists. I won't meet with them.
Yeah, he's a great guy. Let me ask you, if Obama gets reelected, what do the next 4 years look like?
Well, this is harsh, but I don't think it makes any difference whether you get Obama or Mitt Romney in this sense. They are not going to come to terms with the economic reality the way when Ron Paul says we've got to cut $1 trillion, he's not wrong. He's right. The problem with the Ryan plan, which is the only decent solution for the moment available on the Hill, is that Paul Ryan's budget doesn't balance the budget for 30 years. It's not enough. And Obama, his platform is very straightforward. His platform is, I'm going to promise everybody everything for nothing. And I'm going to continue to borrow as we are right now, and I'm going to make up whatever shortfalls there are by confiscating the wealth that people in the United States have. In other words, I'm going to take the money away from anybody who's got it in order to keep these free services and free programs provided by the federal government going in perpetuity. All of it, though, is dependent on something that no one talks about, and that is the bond market, the international bond market. Both Romney and Obama fail to understand something. We are not going to be allowed in the next 2 to 3 years to borrow in perpetuity for decades money at 2% interest. Right. It's not going to stay at 2%. The Fed can't stop it from rising. And when it rises, our debt payments, the requirement to service the debt, is going to be uncontrollable. And we're going to have to make massive cuts. And ultimately, I'm afraid, as Ron Paul has warned, we will default.
And what does that mean?
Europe.
What does that mean, default?
Well, it means that you've got to write down debt. You've got to accept massive losses. Your creditors have to accept those losses. You have to accept those losses. Because remember that if you look at debt, private and public in the United States, it's about 300% of gross national product. Okay? Wow. 300%. Public debt is only 100% now. Only. The other 200% is private. So you're talking about huge losses taken by major financial institutions, and many of them are going to crumble. You're going to watch as massive businesses go under, people are going to lose money, and the free services are going to stop. And that's going to create chaos inside this country. It's going to be a terrible catharsis for us. But it's because people have ignored Ron Paul and his warnings for 30 years of what needs to be done, and they're going to ignore it at the polls because it's much easier to believe in the tooth fairy. And the tooth fairy says you're going to continue to borrow money at 2% forever. And that's just not true.
All right. I know you have another meeting to get to, so I'm not going to keep you too much longer. But I just want you to just elaborate for just a minute for me on what you think America looks like with Ron Paul in the White House. Give me a vision.
Well, Ron Paul would rally, what I would call the base of the American population would rally to him if he became the president, because he would speak to them truthfully, which is something they haven't heard for decades. They haven't heard somebody stand up there and tell them the truth. He would say, look, our so-called overseas empire, our global commitments are not only unnecessary, they're not only bankrupting us, but they're mortgaged to the vanity of people in Washington who like to think that the United States dominates and controls the world. We don't want to dominate or control the world. We don't need to dominate or control it, and we can't afford it. So that's the first thing he would say. And Americans would understand that, regardless of party affiliation or anything else. That would sell quickly. The second thing, he would have to deliver the following bad news. Yes, we're going to cut defense spending, and we're going to have to make some changes in defense so that we can continue to defend ourselves, but we're not going to be able to maintain the current bloated establishment that we have, which is a legacy of World War II and the Cold War. It's going to have to change. That would be fine, but then he would have to deliver extremely bad news on the services side. Because remember that 70% of federal spending today is from free services, effectively programs that provide citizens with benefits they don't have to pay for. And he would have to tell them those are going to be substantially reduced. And along with those, he would go after the federal bureaucracy. Now, much of the federal bureaucracy would not bother most Americans, but it will hurt in the short run and anger in the short run large numbers of people in urban populations in big cities who have become accustomed to everything for nothing. Right. And I think we're going to see violence and disarray there. But he would act quickly and decisively to try and minimize the impact of these reduced services, and he would insist on enforcing the law. The rule of law is very important to Ron Paul. We pay a lot of lip service to it in Washington, but I think your listeners know, I know, that we don't enforce the rule of law. That's how we ended up with tens of millions of people in this country who are not here legally and need to go home because we can't employ them. So inevitably, enforcing the law would be a critical aspect of a Ron Paul administration. All of it would eventually lead to the cure for our ills. We would end up restoring our prosperity. He would invite capital back into the country. He would reduce the regulatory burden on business, particularly small business. And I think within 3 to 4 years of his first term, we would begin to see a true dramatic turnaround, not the kind of fictional nonsense that we hear from Washington about, oh, we have 220,000 jobs. And no one really looks carefully at what are we talking about, these supposed new jobs. And by the way, you've got to produce 400,000 serious new jobs every month to even make a dent. And he would try, and I think he would succeed ultimately as a result of his policies regarding regulation and taxes in bringing back most of that industry which went to China. And the reason is very simple. If you talk to people in the automotive industries or the high-tech industries, they are not happy with what they've got today in China. There are huge labor problems, huge corruption, huge pollution, bad working conditions, a government that is enormously difficult to deal with. Whatever benefits they thought they were going to have when they first went have now vanished. So bringing them back is something that I'm absolutely confident Ron Paul would do.
Well, listen, I hope and pray. I believe in miracles still, sir. And I hope and pray we get one. I can tell you now that whether Ron Paul wins the primary or not, my wife and I have already determined, even if he doesn't win the Republican nod, we're going to write him in. And we don't really care about the consequences because we don't honestly think there's any difference between a Romney and an Obama.
Well, I'm afraid you're right, but there's some good news here, and that is within the next 3 to 4 years, all of the things that Ron Paul has forecast will happen, and ultimately, whether the people who are in power like it or not, the people that ultimately gain power in Washington are going to be compelled to do the things that Ron Paul has outlined. He will win the argument. It's just unfortunate that he could not win it now, because I think the pain would be substantially less than it will ultimately be.
All right, Colonel, how do people get a hold of you?
Well, I've got a website, Doug.Macgregor.com. There's another one that's called FutureDefense.com, and you can Google me on the internet, Douglas A. Macgregor, Macgregor, and interesting things.
All right, thank you, Colonel. Appreciate it very much. God bless, and keep up the good work. It's wonderful to have Veterans for Paul on the show. Thank you, sir.
Okay, same.